At Fort Archer, new recruits are ready to prove their skills, but their confidence is shaken by the arrival of an unexpected figure, Margaret Kaine. An elderly woman with a cane and a vintage rifle, she's initially met with mocking laughter and disbelief from the young soldiers. Dismissed as out of place, Kaine silently prepares for the live fire test. Everyone expects her to fail, especially since she has no spotter. But then her shots ring out, each one hitting dead center with unnerving precision and the smallest spread of the round. The laughter on the range evaporates, replaced by an unsettling silence. Who is this mysterious woman, and what hidden power does her quiet presence hold? If Margaret Kaine's powerful story resonated with you, show your support. Hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to my channel for more inspiring narratives, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Your engagement helps us bring these incredible stories to life. The wind lashed the range, a dry fury pushing swirls of dust like ghosts across the baked gravel. The recruits stood at ease, their banter easy, sharp, the kind that thrives on too much testosterone and too little humility. "Hey, is that your grandma out here to knit us sweaters?" "Nah, bro, she's probably looking for the bingo hall." Their laughter rolled in waves down the line, each echoing chuckle more dismissive than the last. One of them exaggerated a limp, another yawned and mimed a nap. It was rehearsed mockery, adolescent in its confidence. She didn't flinch. Margaret Kaine stopped, eyes calm, posture steady. She took them in with a single glance, not lingering, not needing to. "You think silence means weakness?" Her voice was low, but it cut through the air with the weight of sanded steel. "Silence is how you aim." No one responded. The wind screamed across the firing range as 5 steel silhouettes rose from the earth in the distance, their movement erratic, quick, and unpredictable. The range was a beast today, hot, wild, and unforgiving. One after another, the top recruits stepped forward, cocky, focused, fingers dancing over their high-tech gear like it was an extension of their egos. They missed. Every one of them. Then she stepped up. No advanced optics, no spotter, just an old bolt-action rifle worn with history and hands even older. She didn't adjust, didn't hesitate. She didn't even blink. 5 rounds, 5 strikes, clean, precise, unflinching. Silence fell, not the awkward, unsettled kind that hangs in the air before a joke, but the kind that strips away ego and demands reverence. Something unspoken had shifted. The desert stood still for a moment. In Fort Archer, once a place where voices dominated, where dust never had time to settle, suddenly felt smaller, quieter, as though it had just been reminded of something ancient, something it had forgotten it owed. By 0730, the sun glared down with the fury of 1,000 deserts. It didn't just shine, it punished. The gravel radiated heat, branding boots and turning each breath into vapor. The recruits lined up at the edge of the range, clean uniforms, gleaming ambition, laughter riding high on the adrenaline of morning drills. They looked sharp, almost professional. Optics gleamed, scopes were adjusted with exaggerated calm. But beneath the facade, nervous fingers fumbled at straps and magazines when they thought no one was watching. This was their day, a test of skill, grit, identity, and they were ready to impress, to outperform, to be seen. Then the van rolled up. It looked like it belonged in a museum, sun-bleached olive drab with suspension that creaked like old bones. No markings, no fanfare. The sliding door groaned open, and she stepped out. Margaret Kaine, slowly, steadily. One hand rested on a cane. A weathered rifle case hung from her back. Her clothes were simple, khaki slacks, a windbreaker bleached at the shoulders from too many years in the field, and a faded ball cap with no insignia, just a stitched patch with her name, Kaine. Her silver hair was tucked neatly beneath the brim, her face carved with time and weather. She walked with a slight limp, not from fragility, but from memory. Every step spoke of somewhere she'd been, something she'd survived. At first, they thought it was a mistake. Ma'am, you lost?" one called, laughter hidden behind forced politeness. Another nudged his buddy, smirking. She here to give a guest lecture on flintlocks? That opened the floodgate. Maybe she brought snacks. Grandma's here to knit sniper socks. She ain't qualifying, probably just here for the bingo tent. The laughter came fast now, louder, sharper, more eager to draw a reaction. It bounced off the range like ricochet. She gave them nothing. She didn't look at them, didn't slow, didn't explain. She walked with the deliberate patience of someone who had outlasted things far more dangerous than mockery. She moved through their noise like it was nothing more than wind and heat. From the observation tower, Staff Sergeant Reynolds narrowed his eyes. He hadn't paid much attention when her name came through. Margaret E. Kaine, retired. Special authorization, just another line item in a stack of paperwork. But now, watching her walk through the gauntlet of smirks and ignorance, something made him pause. It wasn't bravado in her step. It wasn't defiance. It was focus, purpose, a gravity that pulled at the edges of the moment. She didn't ask for a partner, didn't even glance at the high-end rifles lined up for selection, just kept walking. And Fort Archer, in all its swagger and sand-scorched tradition, had no idea that what just stepped onto its range wasn't some relic from a forgotten file. It was a legacy, alive, breathing, silent as dust. By the time Kaine reached the edge of the rifle range, the sun was punishing. It baked the steel benches until they shimmered. Shadows beneath the tarp awnings cut sharp lines across the gravel. A few recruits sought refuge in the shade, but most loitered near the gear station, tugging at slings, checking optics, trying too hard not to look nervous. That's when they really saw her. The rifle case slung over her back was no standard issue. Faded olive canvas, leather frayed at the corners, zipper tracks kissed with rust. It looked like it belonged in a glass case at a war museum, not on an active firing line. Her windbreaker sagged a little at the seams, and her boots, well, they looked worn to softness by years, not drills. No armor, no tactical vest, no patches or tabs, just dust, threadbare resolve, and hands that didn't shake. And still she stood straighter than most of them ever had. No high-tech gadgets, no digital gear, no digital. Not even standard issue patches. Just a cane and the unmistakable weight of presence. One recruit leaned into another, trying to stifle a grin. "Is that even regulation?" he whispered, eyes flicking toward the older woman at the end of the row. "Looks like it came straight out of World War II. A voice behind them snickered, low but cutting. "I bet she still calls them krauts. Probably uses a musket too." The laughter spread, not loud but sharp, slicing through the air with cruel precision. Margaret Kaine didn't respond. She said nothing, didn't even flinch. Instead, she walked to the far end of the line, to where the benches gave way to sand. Moving with unhurried grace, she lowered herself to one knee. Then she unfolded a shooting mat with quiet, practiced care, like she'd done it 1,000 times before. When she opened her rifle case, there were a few audible gasps, and then more soft chuckles. Inside lay an old bolt-action rifle, immaculate, but clearly of another era. The stock was aged walnut, rich with time, and faintly carved along the side was a name, Canham. No bipod, no digital scope, no readout. Just metal, wood, and discipline. "Is she serious?" scoffed a young corporal behind mirrored sunglasses. "Might as well throw rocks," someone muttered. A female recruit added under her breath, "Somebody's grandma came to cosplay." Up in the observation tower, Staff Sergeant Reynolds stood with arms folded, squinting down through the glare. He didn't speak, but his brow furrowed as he watched her move. He had read her file, at least the parts that hadn't been redacted. Still, even on paper, Margaret Kaine read like a ghost, an echo from some long-forgotten war. There was something in the way she moved. In the stillness, she carried it with her. She didn't bluff, didn't fidget, didn't put on a show. She simply prepared, with a quietness that seemed immune to all the noise and mockery. Then came the pairing orders. Recruits would take turns spotting for each other during wind and distance drills. Names were rattled off quickly, last names grouped into pairs. When they got to Kaine, the cadence faltered. A half-second pause. No one stepped forward. One recruit inched back. Another suddenly found his bootlaces immensely interesting. The silence stretched, brittle and awkward. She can just go solo, someone muttered. Reynolds still said nothing. He just made a brief note on his clipboard and looked back toward the lone woman at the end of the line. Margaret didn't object. She didn't ask for a partner. She simply reached into her pocket, pulled out a short pencil, opened a worn leather notebook, and started doing her own wind corrections by hand. While others whispered and speculated, she waited for wind, for silence, for the shot that mattered. The first round was just a warm-up. Static targets at 100 yards. A light breeze. Simple enough to separate noise from skill. Recruits lined up in pairs, rifles ready, spotters kneeling beside them with binoculars and notepads in hand. The murmurs still floated along the line, but something in the energy had shifted. Nervous now, uncertain. Margaret Kaine was the only one without a spotter. No one had offered. No one dared. She knelt alone at the far end, her old rifle steady on the mat, face unreadable. Calm. She wasn't fumbling, wasn't hesitating. She was just ready. A few younger recruits kept stealing glances her way, like they were waiting for her to fumble, to miss the shot so completely it would give them something to laugh about later. "Watch this," one of them whispered with a smirk. "She's gonna miss the whole damn target." Then, crack. The sound of her first shot cut through the air, sharp, clean, and perfectly timed between gusts. Not rushed, not hesitant. The nearest spotter froze mid-chew, gum stalled between molars. He slowly lowered his binoculars. "Dead center," he said, barely loud enough for even his partner to hear. "Tight grouping." A few heads turned. Margaret calmly worked the bolt, caught the shell mid-air with fluid motion, and placed it beside her. No drama, no pause. She adjusted the scope just a hair, inhaled, exhaled, then fired again. Ping. Another clean center hit. She didn't move much, just enough. Another breath, another shot. Ping. The murmurs returned, but they were different now, tense, disbelieving. One spotter nudged his partner. "You seeing this?" The laughter from earlier had gone dry in their throats, replaced by something colder. A quiet discomfort, the kind that creeps in when the story you told yourself starts to fall apart. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a fluke. This was something earned, something real, something deliberate. To fail. But she didn't. Margaret Kaine lay prone on the mat, adjusting the rifle with a precision that came not from repetition, but from ritual. Every movement was quiet and purposeful, a whisper of memory guiding her hands. She didn't check to see who was watching. She didn't glance toward the flags for wind. She simply knew. The wind, the weight, the distance, it had all been etched into her over years of dust, fire, and silence. She exhaled slowly, let the world blur at the edges, and pressed the trigger. The shot rang out, slicing through the wind like it owed her something. Then another, then a third. Spotters didn't speak right away. No one did. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if it too needed a moment to understand what had just happened. 3 for 3, dead center, tightest spread yet. A few of the instructors exchanged glances. Harrison clenched his jaw and looked away. No one cheered, no one clapped. But in the taut stillness, a shift occurred, an invisible thread of respect woven silently into the moment. Nobody had expected her to be the standard. Margaret sat up slowly, not triumphant, just thoughtful. She wiped the rifle's stock again with that same neatly folded cloth from her pocket. More habit than need. Around her the air buzzed with unspoken questions, but she heard none of it. What she heard was a jungle, hot and wet, half a world away. The meong. It came back to her all at once. The scent of moss and gun oil, the cloying humidity clinging to every inch of skin. She remembered the fear. Not hers, but his. The young private frozen mid-step, eyes wide as the shots cracked from behind. Her rifle had jerked in her hands before her mind could catch up. Not clean, not perfect, but it had worked. It had saved him. He'd written to her 2 years later, said he named his firstborn after her. She never wrote back. What was there to say? Then came Kuwait, Desert Storm. Not the bullets this time, not the blood. It was the sand that stayed with her. Relentless, insidious. It filled every seam, every joint, every breath. There was a morning her spotter was hit, just dropped mid-call. She hadn't even looked to check if he was dead. Just adjusted her cracked scope, took in the wind, and fired 8 rounds straight through Fury. When the smoke cleared, 7 men were still alive. No medals followed, just nods from men who didn't know how to say thank you. Now she looked down at her own hands. Thinner skin, blue rivers of veins mapping time and distance. But the grip was unchanged, steady as ever. These recruits didn't know who she was, didn't matter. She wasn't here for them. She wasn't here for applause or redemption or to relive anything. She'd buried too many ghosts for that. She was here to test one thing, the fire. Not the fire of war that had long been spent, but the deeper fire, the one for discipline, for control, for that razor-thin edge between precision and chaos. That cold fire that lived in the marrow of a soldier who had once made peace with violence, but never forgot how to wield it. This wasn't war. This was Fort Archer. A dusty range, an old rifle, and a line in the sand only she could see. And she crossed it, not to prove she still could, but to confirm that if the day ever came, if the reason was real and the moment demanded it, her hands would not hesitate. Not once, not ever. They had been watching her, whether out of curiosity or the quiet intention to see her fail. Either and all eyes were on her. Margaret Kaine didn't flinch under the weight of their attention. She laid out her weathered shooting mat on the sand, moving with calm precision as she lowered herself into position. Her old bolt-action rifle, worn smooth in the grip, came up to her shoulder like it belonged there, as though it had never left. No spotter stood beside her. She didn't need one. She listened. The wind carried stories. It shifted and she closed her eyes for a brief moment, feeling the air drift across her cheek like a whisper from the past. Then her fingers moved, flipping open a small, tattered notebook filled with scrawls and faded pencil marks. A quick notation, a final adjustment, then silence, the kind that settles before thunder. Crack, first shot, ping, a clean, dead-on hit, second shot, ping, direct center, then third, fourth, fifth, ping, ping, ping. Each bullet struck home with such tight precision, the spotter squinted, leaned in, and checked the grouping again, just to be sure he wasn't dreaming. "All targets hit," he called out after a stunned pause. 2-inch spread, cleanest grouping of the day. Nobody moved, nobody clapped, not even Harrison, who always had something smart to say. Staff Sergeant Reynolds slowly removed his sunglasses, his expression caught somewhere between awe and unease, like he'd just seen something sacred that he'd never meant to witness, something that made the world feel slightly off-kilter, like a truth he'd built his beliefs around had shifted beneath him. Margaret didn't bask in their silence. She didn't offer so much as a glance at the others. No nod, no smirk, no acknowledgement of their stunned expressions. She simply stood up, dusted the grit from her knees, and walked off without a word, as if she'd merely finished tying her boots or sipping her morning coffee. But her footsteps left echoes behind. Not sound, but something heavier. The kind of quiet that doesn't fall like a curtain. It rises, unshakable and cold, like truth surfacing from deep water. Where laughter had once filled the space, there was now only stillness. The kind that clutches the chest and shortens breath. The kind that rewrites how people are seen. In that moment, Margaret Kaine ceased to be the butt of a joke. She wasn't even a curiosity anymore. She had become the measuring stick, and every man and woman who stood on that range knew it, felt it in their bones. That night, as the desert wind finally settled and the stars burned high above the base, Staff Sergeant Reynolds couldn't let go of the voice of the spotter echoing in his mind. 5 for 5. Tightest grouping yet. He had heard great shooting before. He had trained champions, led competitions. But what she'd done that afternoon wasn't just skill. It was something else, something colder, cleaner. A memory made muscle, precision like a scalpel. Long after the last recruit had turned in and the mess hall lights flickered off, Reynolds remained behind in the admin office. The only light came from the overhead bulb, flickering and buzzing like a mosquito stuck in amber. He pulled out the old personnel database, a digital relic no one under 30 ever touched, and typed, "Kaine, Margaret E." The screen hesitated, loading in fits. Then finally it spilled open. First Sergeant, U.S. Army, enlisted, 1968, Vietnam War, 2 tours completed, later reactivated for Operation Desert Storm. Decorated marksman, 6-time expert qualification, commendations for leadership under fire, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Then came the redacted section. Lines blacked out, crossed over, made unreadable. But one line remained intact. Unofficial kill count, unconfirmed, assumed high. Known to have extracted a pinned unit under direct enemy fire in the Al Ghalib Corridor, 1991, Reynolds blinked. That name, Al Ghalib Corridor, was burned into the memory of every soldier worth their salt. A unit trapped in open terrain for hours, casualties rising, situation hopeless. Until, the story went, a single marksman eliminated 5 hostiles in rapid succession from nearly a kilometer away, allowing the survivors to escape. No one had ever confirmed the identity of the shooter. No one needed to. Until now. He scrolled further. No disciplinary reports. No misconduct. Post-retirement, worked with inner-city youth, firearm safety, precision training, quiet, disciplined, purposeful. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, the breath leaving him all at once. He remembered how he'd stood there earlier, arms crossed, lips pressed tight, while the others sneered, whispered, laughed behind her back. He hadn't said a word, not because he didn't know better, but because he had believed it too, that she was chasing ghosts. But now he knew the truth. She was the ghost, the kind that doesn't haunt, the kind that built everything you stand on. She had no need to prove herself. Not to them, not to him. She had done that already, long ago, in places soaked with sweat and fear and blood. Under fire, under pressure, where it mattered. And now she was back, not for applause, not for recognition, but to be certain her hands hadn't forgotten what her soul had etched into them decades ago. Reynolds printed the file, folded it with quiet care into a manila folder, and stood slowly. He didn't know what he'd say to her the next day, if anything, but he knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow, he'd be the one listening. The barracks had barely settled into silence when the alarm tore through the base, sharp and urgent, a siren breaking the night. Then came the shouting. Boots hit the floors, lights snapped on. Stock like it was a homecoming. The air stilled. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as she took her position. Reynolds stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching her with a new kind of silence. It wasn't curiosity. It was something closer to respect. The instructor hesitated for a second, just a heartbeat, before giving the nod. Shooter ready. Margaret didn't answer. She didn't need to. The first target swept across the field, fast, sudden, vanishing behind brush. Her rifle cracked once. Hit. The second, slower, dipped and rose like it was teasing the shooter. Another shot, clean, unhurried. Hit. She wasn't chasing the targets. She was waiting for them to reveal themselves, letting the rhythm of the wind, the shifting silence of the range, guide her. 3 down, 4. On the 5th, even the instructors leaned in. It jerked unexpectedly, then paused mid-glide, a hesitation that would throw anyone off. But she didn't hesitate. Final shot, direct hit, silence. Then the voice of the spotter, almost reverent. 5 confirmed, full pass. No one spoke at first. Then a low exhale spread through the group like wind across tall grass. Harrison looked down at his own gear, suddenly unsure if all the tech in the world could ever teach what she carried in her bones. She didn't smile, just stood slowly, slinging the rifle over her shoulder like she had in the beginning. As if this moment was never about proving anything. It was about remembering who she was. As she stepped off the line, Vega whispered to Juno, "Did you see that?" Juno just nodded, eyes wide. Yeah, that wasn't shooting. That was storytelling. And maybe that's what set her apart. While the others chased glory or ranks or numbers, Margaret Kaine moved through every moment like she was writing something into the dirt. Something sacred, etched in silence and scars, in every breath between heartbeats. The stock was worn smooth from years of use. The faint initials McCain still etched into the wood like an old memory refusing to fade. A dry wind swept through the range, lifting sand in sharp waves that stung the air. A wall of dust moved across the line, blurring vision for most. But not for her. The first target swung into sight. Crack. Hit. Second. Crack. Hit. Third. Crack. Confirmed. Fourth. Crack. Center mass. Fifth, just as the wind picked up, jerking the target erratically. She didn't flinch. Crack. A pause. The range went still. Final target. Down. Short of them. Every last one. Tightest grouping ever recorded. No one moved. No one breathed. Even Harrison, who had worn that smug grin all morning, stood rooted to the spot, his smirk long vanished. Reynolds didn't applaud. He didn't have to. He stepped forward slowly, voice low and steady, then waited. The silence stretched before he finally spoke. That is what excellence looks like. Quiet, precise, earned. Margaret brushed the dust from her knees like it was routine, like she'd done it 1,000 times before. She gave a slight nod, not to herself, not to the others, but to the ghost that had followed her into this desert. There was no smile on her face, but the silence surrounding her thundered louder than any ovation ever could. And across that sun-baked expanse, from raw recruits to seasoned instructors, everyone knew. What they had just witnessed wasn't merely skill. It wasn't just a demonstration of talent. It was legacy, etched not in ribbons or salutes, but in crosshairs and silence. Later at the mess hall, Fort Archer felt unnaturally still. Usually the place was alive with the sharp clang of metal trays, the scrape of boots across tile, and bursts of laughter rising and falling like waves. But not that day. Not after that. Margaret Kaine sat where she always did, back corner by the window where the afternoon light painted gold across the far wall. Same tray, same posture, elbows tight, back straight, eating in the quiet rhythm of someone long accustomed to solitude. But this time, the silence that surrounded her wasn't alienation. It was reverence. No one laughed. No one imitated her limp. No one made lazy jokes about iuanj or knitting needles. Across the room, Harrison sat hunched over his coffee, staring into it like it might offer answers. He hadn't said a word since the range. Not really. Not to anyone. Eventually he stood. The echo of his boots carried louder than usual across the quiet hall. Forks hovered midair as recruits paused mid-bite. Even Reynolds, seated far off, leaned ever so slightly forward. Harrison stopped at her table. Margaret didn't look up. He cleared his throat. Then again. Sergeant Kaine, he said, quieter than anyone had ever heard him. I was wrong. She paused mid-chew, slowly set her fork down. About all of it? He added, his fingers twitching, uncertain at his sides. About you. Yeah, I'll remember that shot for the rest of my life. Only then did she raise her eyes to meet his. She gave him a small nod, tired, wordless, but real. That was all. But to him, it wasn't small at all. And without another word, he turned and walked away, swallowed back into the stillness that filled the hall like dust. Moments later, 2 younger recruits, Vega and Juno, approached her table, the same ones who had mocked her limp and her age earlier in the week. Now they stood awkwardly, trays in hand, their eyes cast low like kids who knew they'd gone too far. Mind if we ask you something? Juno asked. About the wind drift, the adjustment? Margaret looked at the empty chairs across from her, then shifted her tray slightly, wordlessly clearing the space. They sat, not as equals, but as students. For 20 minutes they didn't ask about rifles, not really. They asked about patience, about the feel of timing, about what it meant to wait for the right moment to squeeze the trigger. She spoke in fragments, quiet, clipped sentences, enough to guide, never enough to preach. When her tray was empty, Margaret rose without a word. She slung her rifle case over her shoulder and headed for the exit. No applause followed, no fanfare, but every head in that mess hall turned to watch her go. And long after she stepped into the sun-drenched dust of Fort Archer, the space she left behind still held her shape, not heavy, not haunting, but anchored, like something old and unwavering, something that refused to be forgotten. Because from that day on, at Fort Archer, respect wasn't about rank. It wasn't demanded, it wasn't assumed. It was earned in silence. True warriors don't raise their voices. They don't beat their chests. They don't remind you of medals. They don't have to. She didn't arrive with noise, nor did she come wrapped in medals or fanfare. There was no grand introduction, no sweeping gesture announcing her presence. Just a faded uniform, a weathered case, and a woman moving with quiet certainty. Margaret Kaine didn't posture. She didn't boast. She simply showed up, leveled her rifle, drew a steady breath, and let the silence do the talking. Not once did she raise her voice. Not when they doubted her. Not when they looked past her, assuming age had dulled her edge. And yet, the silence she left in her wake at Fort Archer roared louder than any drill sergeant ever could. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pride. It was presence, the kind that shifts a room without ever demanding attention. From the moment she stepped through the gates of that base, Margaret had been seen as an outsider, dismissed before she had even touched a weapon. But she didn't try to correct them. She didn't defend her worth or ask for a second glance. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than anyone's doubts ever could. She didn't win them over with words. She didn't need to argue, persuade, or prove anything in a speech. What she did was far harder. She stayed steady, deliberate, focused, shot after shot, step after step, no flair, no grandstanding, just the kind of unshakable discipline born not from manuals or academy lessons, but from blood-soaked battlefields and the scars no one ever sees. She had lived what others only trained for. She had endured what many never returned from, and in doing so she rewrote the entire atmosphere of that base. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk when her shot groups were tighter than recruits half her age. She didn't seek praise when her name quietly rose to the top of the list. She just kept working, calm, silent, ruthlessly precise. This is the kind of leadership the world forgets to honor, the kind that doesn't broadcast itself with hashtags or selfies. It doesn't strut or demand applause. It just holds steady in the chaos, drawing strength from something deeper than validation. Dignity. And legacy? It doesn't shine under spotlights. It lingers in the quiet spaces, leaving footprints behind for others to follow. By the time her assignment at Fort Archer ended, Margaret hadn't merely passed a test or met a standard. She had etched a lesson into the soul of the base, reminding a younger generation that skill doesn't belong to youth alone, and that real strength doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it walks in slowly, with a faded case, a lifetime of memories, and the steadiest hand in the room. There's talk of a new recruit arriving next month. Another woman, younger, hopeful, maybe a little unsure. Someone standing at the edge of the very same doubts Margaret once faced. But maybe, just maybe, this time they won't laugh so easily. Maybe one of them will remember the older woman who moved slower than most, but hit harder than anyone expected. The one who didn't need to say a word to be remembered. Maybe this time they'll pause before they judge. Maybe they'll listen a little more carefully. Because silence, when it comes from someone who has endured war, both on the battlefield and in life, isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And wisdom doesn't leave with a shout. It stands quietly, long enough for others to steady their aim, breathe deeper, and do better. Margaret Kaine's story was never just about a rifle or a shooting range. It's not even just about military service. It's about something more enduring, more personal. It's about how we see one another. How often do we underestimate someone because of their age? How often do we ignore the quiet ones? The woman who walks slower, the man who speaks less, the one who just shows up every day, doing what needs to be done without asking for credit. In a world that celebrates noise, Margaret Kaine is a gentle reminder of something sacred. That true power often walks in silence, and real grace doesn't beg to be noticed. This isn't just about honoring veterans. It's about learning to honor the quiet pillars in our everyday lives. Our elders, our neighbors, our co-workers, even strangers whose names we may never know, but whose steadiness makes everything else possible. So maybe now's the moment to ask yourself, who is the Margaret Kaine in your life? Who is that quiet, steady presence holding everything together while the world rushes past? Have you ever thanked them? Have you even seen them? Take a second to remember. Maybe even share their story, or your own. If you've ever been overlooked, doubted, underestimated, and yet kept going without saying a word, proving everything in silence. Those stories matter. Your voice matters. Because sometimes it only takes one story like Margaret's to remind us. Silence isn't the absence of strength. It's where real strength gathers and where legacy begins.